HOA Karen opened fire on my sister's wedding day, but she had no idea who I am. The first sound wasn't music, laughter, or applause. It was the crack of gunfire tearing through the air like a thunderclap. A single bullet ripped into the silence of joy, shattering the fragile peace of what was supposed to be the happiest day of my sister's life. The wedding guests froze for a fraction of a second before chaos erupted. Screams cut through the warm summer afternoon, chairs clattered onto the ground, and flowers that had been carefully arranged for weeks were trampled underfoot as people dove for cover. Panic spread like wildfire, the choir scattered, and children cried out in terror as parents shielded them with trembling arms. For one awful heartbeat, nobody knew where the shot had come from, or who had the audacity to turn a sacred celebration into a battlefield. Then the answer revealed itself in the most horrifying way possible. Standing defiantly at the edge of the ceremony, clutching a smoking weapon with a wild, self-righteous gleam in her eye, was the woman who had poisoned our neighborhood for years. It was Karen, the self-appointed guardian of everything she believed belonged to her, the nightmare of every homeowner unfortunate enough to live within her grasp, and the one person determined to make sure this day would never go as planned. Her presence wasn't an accident. She had come prepared, armed, and burning with the same hatred that had consumed her long before this wedding ever took place. Guests scattered in waves, their elegant clothes flashing like streaks of color against the manicured lawn as fear overtook them. The pastor dropped to the ground, the best man threw himself over the cake, and even the photographer abandoned his camera in the dirt as survival instincts kicked in. My sister, dressed in white and trembling, clutched her husband's arm, her face a mask of shock and terror. This was supposed to be the day she remembered as the beginning of forever, yet here she was, standing frozen in her gown as the woman from down the street turned her vows into screams. Karen's voice rang out over the chaos, shrill and unyielding, as she shouted words no one could fully comprehend. To her, this wasn't just a wedding. It was an offense, an insult to her authority, a declaration of war on the rules and control she believed were hers alone to enforce. She called it a disgrace to the neighborhood, spitting venom with every syllable. But the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. She thrived on destruction, and she had chosen this day, this sacred moment, to finally prove that she could destroy happiness itself. The gun rose again, and another shot rang out, echoing against the walls of the church and through the open windows. Guests ducked lower, some praying aloud, others crying uncontrollably as the nightmare unfolded. Time seemed to stretch, every second lasting a lifetime, but in the center of the storm I didn't flinch. Because, unlike everyone else, I wasn't just another terrified witness. Unlike everyone else, I knew something Karen didn't. And that knowledge kept me calm, steady, even as the world dissolved into panic around me. Her arrogance blinded her. She thought she knew the players on the stage, thought she was punishing strangers who had dared to defy her. But Karen had no idea who I really was, or why she had just crossed a line that could never be erased. For years, she had pushed, harassed, and tormented families under her rule. She thought this was her ultimate victory, that she was the one holding all the power. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that she had just made her last move. As the echoes of her gunshot rolled away and the screams of my family still hung in the air, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't only the story of a ruined wedding. This was the moment her downfall began. And though she came armed with a weapon, she was completely unprepared for the truth I carried, the truth that would dismantle her piece by piece until she was left with nothing. She opened fire on my sister's wedding day, but she had no idea who I am, and she was about to find out. To truly understand the chaos of that day, you need to know what led us there. My sister's wedding wasn't just an ordinary celebration. It was the culmination of years of sacrifice, resilience, and hope. She had always been the light in our family, the one who believed in love when the rest of us had almost forgotten what it meant. Through every storm, every trial, she carried herself with grace, And when she finally met the man she wanted to spend forever with, it felt like a miracle had touched our lives. This wedding was more than flowers, rings, and vows. It was a declaration of triumph, proof that goodness could bloom even after years of bitterness. But life has a way of placing shadows over the brightest days, and that shadow had a name: Karen. From the very beginning, she seemed to see our joy as an attack against her. She wasn't family, she wasn't invited, and she certainly wasn't welcome. Yet, somehow, she had wormed her way into every detail leading up to the wedding, whispering poison into the ears of anyone who would listen, filing complaints with the city about parking congestion and noise violations threatening vendors, and demanding that the event be canceled. She claimed the ceremony would disturb the peace of the neighborhood, though the truth was simpler. She despised the idea of someone else being happy when she had nothing but misery to cling to. To understand why her hatred burned so fiercely, you have to know the world she ruled. Our community wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a kingdom, and Karen had crowned herself queen. She patrolled the streets like a hawk, ticketing kids for riding their bikes too close to her lawn, fining families for hanging Christmas lights she didn't approve of, and threatening legal action over paint colors that didn't match the community standards. She wore the title of HOA president like armor. But behind her rules and regulations, she was nothing more than a lonely, bitter woman who found purpose only in control. Still, my family refused to let her dictate the terms of our happiness. My sister and her fiancé poured their souls into creating a wedding that would be remembered for its love, not its battles. They chose the church down the street because it was where generations of our family had exchanged vows. They picked a garden reception because my sister dreamed of dancing under the stars. Every detail was carefully chosen, every moment crafted with meaning. It was a dream she'd carried since childhood, and no petty tyrant was going to take that away from her. But even as we decorated the aisles and rehearsed the vows, we could feel Karen's presence pressing in. She showed up, uninvited, at the rehearsal dinner, lurking at the edges, pretending she had business with the pastor. She called the police twice during setup, insisting that the delivery trucks for the reception were blocking her view of the street. On the morning of the wedding, as the sun rose over the church steeple, we found flyers stuffed into mailboxes claiming that the ceremony was illegal and unsafe. They were unsigned, of course, but no one needed a signature to know who was behind them. For my sister's sake, we pushed forward, forcing smiles as we adjusted decorations and calmed nervous guests. The day would go on, we told ourselves. We wouldn't let one woman steal what belonged to us. And for a while, it seemed we might succeed. The bride walked down the aisle, radiant and trembling with joy. The groom's eyes glistened with tears. The choir sang, the pastor smiled, and for a fleeting moment, everything felt perfect. But perfection is fragile. Beneath the surface, tension was coiled tight, waiting to strike. Karen had always thrived on escalation. She wasn't satisfied with warnings or threats. If she couldn't break us with rules, she would break us with fear. She had spent years rehearsing her role as judge, jury, and executioner of the neighborhood. And on this day, she was ready to step into the part she believed she was born to play. Looking back, all the warning signs were there. The late-night phone calls with no answer when we picked up. The strange cars idling near the church the week before. The sudden silence from neighbors who once supported us but now avoided our eyes. Karen had been planning something bigger than anyone could imagine. And yet, blinded by love, by hope, by the desperate desire to give my sister her dream wedding, we didn't see it coming. What none of us realized, what only became clear when the first gunshot echoed through the air, was that Karen wasn't just out to ruin a ceremony. She wanted to rewrite the story of our family forever. She wanted to make our happiest day the one we could never forget for all the wrong reasons. And as I stood there, watching the petals scatter across the aisle like bloodstained confetti, I knew we were facing something far darker than a neighbor with a grudge. We were staring down a woman who believed destruction was her right. But here's the part that no one, not even Karen herself, understood. She was about to learn that this family, my family, wasn't as fragile as she thought. Karen was never the type to strike out of nowhere. every act of hers was calculated, dripping with malice, yet coated in a thin veneer of self-righteousness. To her, every smile from our family was an insult, every gathering was a threat, and every shred of happiness we managed to find was somehow an assault on her kingdom. She thrived on building tension, stacking one petty cruelty on top of another until she felt invincible. By the time the wedding approached, she had perfected the art of escalation. It began with whispers. Anonymous letters slipped under our door, claiming that the neighborhood deserved better than our kind. She never signed them, but the jagged strokes of the handwriting and the smug phrasing were unmistakably hers. Then came the threats of fines from the HOA. Penalties for leaving decorations up too early, warnings about noise pollution from rehearsals, and even citations about cars parked too close to the curb. It wasn't just harassment, it was psychological warfare, a campaign designed to break us before the wedding bells could ever ring. And Karen didn't stop at paper threats. She had a talent for intimidation, lurking on the edges of our property with her phone raised high as if she were gathering evidence for some invisible jury. Neighbors who had once greeted us warmly now turned away under her glare, unwilling to risk becoming her next target. Vendors for the wedding reported mysterious phone calls canceling their services. The florist arrived trembling, admitting that someone had threatened to report her shop for illegal activity if she delivered flowers to the church. The DJ received emails accusing him of corrupting the neighborhood youth. Each attack was small, but together they formed a noose tightening around us. My sister tried to stay strong, brushing off Karen's antics with a brave smile. But late at night, I could hear her crying in her room, terrified that her perfect day was unraveling before it even began. The groom clenched his fists in anger, swearing he wouldn't let one woman ruin what they had built. And me? I felt the familiar burn of rage, the kind that comes from watching someone you love being crushed beneath the weight of another's cruelty. Karen's power didn't come from her position in the HOA, it came from fear. She knew how to isolate her victims, to make them doubt themselves, to erode their joy piece by piece until they surrendered. She thrived on control, and the more we resisted, the more dangerous she became. The closer we got to the wedding, the bolder her attacks grew. On the day of the rehearsal, she stood across the street with binoculars, shouting insults loud enough for everyone to hear. "This wedding is a disgrace," she shrieked, her voice cracking like a whip. When my mother tried to reason with her, Karen laughed in her face, calling us unfit to live here. The police were called, but by the time they arrived, she had melted back into her house, smug and untouchable. But her obsession with control wasn't just about rules or power, it was personal. Somewhere deep inside her twisted mind, our happiness reminded her of everything she had lost, or maybe never had. The love my sister and her fiancé shared, the unity of our family, the warmth of people coming together, these were things Karen couldn't buy, couldn't steal, and couldn't regulate out of existence. And so, she did the only thing she knew how. She tried to destroy them. The week before the wedding, she escalated again. Strange cars began idling near our home, their engines humming in the dead of night before disappearing into the darkness. Packages were stolen from our porch, invitations ripped from mailboxes. Even the church wasn't spared. Graffiti scrawled across the back wall read, "Happiness is forbidden here." No one saw who did it, but we all knew. Karen's fingerprints were on every act of vandalism, even if the law couldn't prove it. Still, through every assault we pushed forward. We bought new flowers when the old ones were ruined. We hired replacements for vendors who backed out. We prayed, we fought, and we clung to each other with the desperate hope that love would be stronger than hate. My sister refused to call off the wedding, standing tall in the face of the storm. "She can't take this from me," she whispered one night, her eyes red from crying. "She won't win." But Karen wasn't done. If anything, our resilience only fueled her fury. By the time the wedding day dawned, she had convinced herself that this wasn't just about a neighborhood dispute, it was a war. In her mind, she wasn't attacking a family, she was defending her territory. and she was prepared to escalate beyond fines, threats, and vandalism. She was ready to cross a line she could never return from. Looking back, the signs of what was coming were all around us. The sharpened edge of her words, the gleam of madness in her eyes, the chilling way she whispered, "You'll regret this," as she walked past us the night before the wedding. She had already made her decision. The only thing left was for us to discover just how far she was willing to go. And so, as the guests gathered and the music began, as love filled the air and vows were prepared, Karen made her move. She had spent years rehearsing her role as tyrant, tormentor, and judge. Now, she was ready to become something far darker. The escalation was complete, the mask was off, and the real danger was only just beginning. The morning of the wedding began with sunlight breaking over the church steeple, golden rays spilling across the carefully arranged rows of chairs, flowers swaying in the gentle breeze, and a sense of peace that felt almost too good to be true. For a few precious hours, everything was as it should be. Guests arrived dressed in their finest, their laughter filling the courtyard. The choir rehearsed soft hymns while the pastor checked over his notes. My sister was radiant, her white gown glowing like a promise, her eyes shimmering with hope as she prepared to walk down the aisle. For the first time in weeks, the tension seemed to fade, replaced by joy so bright it nearly blinded us. But peace never lasts when hatred is waiting just outside the door. As the ceremony began, there was a hush and awe-filled silence as the bride and groom took their places. The pastor's voice rang out, steady and warm, weaving words of love and unity. The guests smiled, the groom reached for my sister's trembling hands, and for a heartbeat, the world held its breath. It was the moment every wedding dreams of, the sacred pause before vows are spoken, before lives are joined. And then it happened. The crack of a gunshot shattered the air, sharp and merciless. Birds scattered from the trees, guests screamed, and the organist's hands froze against the keys as sound and silence collided in violent harmony. For a split second, no one moved. We all stood frozen, eyes wide, hearts pounding, unable to believe what we had just heard. But then reality rushed in, swift and brutal. Chairs overturned as people dove for the ground. The children cried out, their parents dragging them beneath tables, shielding them with their bodies. The beautiful order of the wedding dissolved into chaos. At the edge of the courtyard, framed against the sunlight, like a nightmare dragged into the day, stood Karen. Her face twisted with fury, her eyes wild, her hand clutching the weapon she had smuggled past everyone's notice. Smoke curled from the barrel of her gun, and on her lips was a sneer that chilled me more than the gunfire itself. She wasn't surprised by the chaos she'd caused, she reveled in it. This wasn't madness. This was intention. "This wedding is over," she screamed, her voice slicing through the panic. "I warned you. I told you all this was a disgrace, an insult to the neighborhood, and I will not allow it." Her words were shrill, but her grip on the weapon was steady, terrifyingly steady. This wasn't a warning shot meant to scare us. She had come to enforce her will, to rewrite the day in blood and terror if necessary. My sister clung to her groom, her veil trembling as her whole body shook. He wrapped his arms around her, his jaw clenched, his eyes locked on Karen with a mixture of fear and rage. Guests crawled across the ground, trying to escape. The choir huddled behind the altar, whispering frantic prayers. And through it all, Karen moved with frightening calm, as though she were the only one in control. The second shot rang out, echoing off the church walls, sending another wave of screams through the crowd. The bullet lodged into a column, splintering stone, showering dust over the guests. The pastor ducked, his Bible slipping from his hands, pages fluttering like broken wings. In the chaos, I watched Karen's face, saw the satisfaction flicker across her features, as if she believed she had finally won. But beneath her arrogance was blindness. She thought she was teaching us a lesson, breaking our family, proving that no one could defy her. What she didn't know was that her every action was being etched into a story she couldn't control, a story that would end not with her victory, but with her downfall. As people crawled and scrambled, some tried to plead with her. A guest shouted, "Think about what you're doing." Another cried, "Please, Karen, stop." But she only raised her voice higher, spewing venom about order and respect. She believed she was the judge of all things, that her word carried more weight than law, love, or life itself. The police were called, but in those moments before help arrived, it was pure survival. The groom tried to stand to shield my sister, but Karen swung the gun toward him, her finger tightening on the trigger. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Time slowed, every heartbeat stretching into eternity. My own fists clenched, my breath caught, and a fire unlike anything I had ever felt surged inside me. I wanted to lunge to end this, but I knew one wrong move, and she would take more than vows away from us. And yet, even as terror gripped the courtyard, I found a strange calm inside myself. Because deep down, I knew something Karen didn't. She thought she was punishing strangers, faceless neighbors who had dared to stand against her. But she had no idea who I was. She had no idea the history I carried, the truths buried beneath her arrogance. She had made the mistake of crossing a line she didn't even know existed. Another gunshot rang out, closer this time, ripping through the fabric of my sister's veil, missing her by inches. Gasps turned into sobs, and for a moment I feared the worst. But she stood still, her groom refusing to let her fall, both of them holding onto each other as though love itself could shield them. It was a moment of defiance, fragile yet unbreakable, and it burned into me like fire. The sound of sirens finally pierced the air, faint but growing louder. For the first time, Karen's expression faltered. The sneer wavered, replaced by something sharper, more desperate. She wasn't finished, not yet, but the spell of her control was breaking. Neighbors who once bowed to her authority now cowered in disgust. Guests who had once feared her now whispered of her insanity. And me? I stood ready, not with fear, but with the knowledge that she had just sealed her fate. The attack on my sister's wedding wasn't just a crime. It was the moment Karen revealed her truest self to the world. And though she fired the shots, she had no idea that this day wouldn't be remembered as her triumph. It would be remembered as the day she began to lose everything. The sirens grew louder, a rising wail cutting through the chaos of screams and sobs, promising order in the middle of devastation. Guests clung to each other, their once celebratory clothes stained with dirt and fear as they crawled from under tables and pews. My sister's gown was torn, her veil frayed, her face pale as she clung desperately to her new husband. The wedding that was supposed to be remembered for love and joy was already scarred, rewritten in the ink of gunfire and terror. But Karen stood tall, her gun still raised, as if she were the hero in her own story. Her chest heaved with fury, her hair clung to her damp forehead. And yet, her eyes sparkled with the smug satisfaction of a woman who believed she was untouchable. When the first patrol cars skidded to a halt outside the church gates, red and blue lights painting the walls in flashing urgency, Karen didn't drop the weapon. Instead, she lifted her chin higher, pointing toward the crowd like a queen addressing her subjects. "I warned them," she shouted, her voice carrying even over the sirens. "I told you all this would happen. They defied the rules, they mocked the order of this community, and I acted because no one else had the courage to do it." Her words were laced with venom, but also with conviction. To Karen, this wasn't madness, it was duty. She had twisted her delusions into righteousness, convincing herself that every act of destruction was justified. The police stepped forward cautiously, their weapons drawn, their commands sharp and urgent. "Drop the gun. Drop it now." But Karen only laughed, the sound brittle and unhinged. "I am the law here. Do you understand? Without me, this neighborhood falls into chaos. I did this to protect you." The guests recoiled in disbelief. Some shouted back, their voices raw with fear and anger, "You could have killed us. This was a wedding, not a war. You've lost your mind." Yet Karen ignored them, her gaze locked on the bride and groom, her lip curling in contempt. "You don't belong here," she spat, her voice dripping with hatred. "People like you ruin everything decent. You brought this on yourselves." The groom's face hardened, his protective arm around my sister tightening. He tried to speak, his voice trembling but defiant. "You've gone too far, Karen. This isn't order, it's evil." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her expression. Just for a second, the mask cracked, but she quickly covered it with another shriek, lifting the gun again as if to reclaim control. The police advanced, voices firmer now, demanding her surrender. The moment was tense, balanced on the edge of disaster. And then it happened, the slip that would haunt her forever. As the officers closed in, Karen screamed again. But this time her rage spilled into words she hadn't planned, words that revealed more than she intended. "This family has been a stain on my life for years. I won't let them destroy me again." The guests fell silent. Confusion rippled through the crowd. The officers exchanged looks. To everyone else, it seemed like nonsense, the rant of a woman unraveling under the weight of her own hatred. But to me, it was confirmation. She wasn't just targeting a wedding. She wasn't just targeting neighbors. This was personal, deeply, intimately personal. And that was when I knew it was time to stop hiding. I stepped forward from the crowd, my voice calm but carrying weight that silenced even Karen's screams. "You should have thought twice before firing that gun, Karen," I said, "because the one person you didn't recognize in this crowd is the one person who knows exactly what you've done and why your little empire is about to come crashing down." Her eyes snapped to me, widening in shock. For the first time all day, she faltered. Her hand trembled, the gun dipping ever so slightly as recognition flickered in her expression. "You," she whispered, the word trembling with disbelief. I saw it then, the fear behind her rage. She had spent years believing she was invincible, that her cruelty carried no consequences. But seeing me, hearing my voice, tore open the one secret she had buried deeper than all her petty fines, threats, and rules. She knew exactly who I was, and she knew why my presence meant the end of her reign. The officers seized the moment, moving in swiftly. Shouts filled the air, commands, the scrape of boots against pavement, the metallic clatter of the gun hitting the ground. In seconds, Karen was restrained, her arms wrenched behind her back, her body thrashing as she shrieked curses at everyone around her. But her eyes never left mine, filled with a hatred that barely masked her terror. "You don't know what you're doing," she screamed as they dragged her toward the patrol car. "You think you've won, but you'll regret this. You'll regret crossing me." The crowd erupted in relief, some collapsing into tears, others clinging to one another as the nightmare finally began to fade. My sister sobbed into her husband's shoulder, trembling but alive, safe. Guests whispered prayers of gratitude, thanking heaven the day hadn't ended in tragedy. But as Karen's voice echoed into the distance, carried away by flashing lights and the roar of engines, I stood still, watching her disappear. Because I knew something no one else did. This wasn't over, not yet. Her arrest was only the beginning. The real battle was about to begin, and it would take place not on the streets, but in the courtroom, where her lies would be stripped away and her empire of fear dismantled piece by piece. And through it all, I carried the one truth Karen had always underestimated. The past has a way of catching up with you. She thought she knew every neighbor, every enemy, every rule that could be bent to her will. But she never realized that the person standing quietly in the crowd was someone she had wronged long before this day ever came. She had no idea who I really was. But now, as the police car carried her away, she finally began to understand that the truth she had spent years running from was about to destroy her. The morning after Karen was taken away, the neighborhood didn't feel like the same place anymore. The air carried the heaviness of unanswered questions, whispers in hushed tones, and the uneasy knowledge that a line had been crossed that could never be erased. Weddings were supposed to leave behind laughter and joy. Ours had left behind gunpowder, fear, and a wound carved into the heart of the community. And though the police had dragged Karen away in handcuffs, her shadow lingered over every house, every conversation, every whispered prayer. The investigation began almost immediately. Detectives interviewed witnesses, gathering statements from trembling guests who still struggled to put into words what they had seen. The shattered column at the church stood as silent evidence. The bullet holes a permanent scar against sacred stone. The pastor, once so full of warmth, now walked with his shoulders heavy as though burdened by the memory of the chaos in his sanctuary. My sister and her new husband clung to each other like survivors of a storm, their love still intact, but their wedding day forever stolen by the sound of gunfire. But outside our family's grief, something darker brewed. Karen might have been behind bars, but the homeowners association she had ruled for years was not ready to surrender her throne. Her allies, board members she had charmed, manipulated, or threatened into loyalty, immediately sprang into action. Within hours, a letter circulated through the neighborhood, stamped with the HOA's seal, calling Karen's arrest a misunderstanding. They claimed she had acted under duress, that her actions were provoked, and that the real criminals were those who had disrespected community regulations. It was a slap in the face to every guest who had cowered under those gunshots, to every child who had cried in terror. To my sister, who still woke screaming from nightmares of her veil, tearing in the wind of a passing bullet. Yet somehow, some neighbors bought the lie. Fear and habit made them cling to the idea that Karen was still untouchable. She had controlled them for so long that even in her absence, they couldn't imagine a world where she wasn't pulling the strings. The community began to fracture. Some stood firmly with us, demanding justice, outraged at the audacity of the HOA's defense. Others whispered excuses, murmuring about how Karen had done so much for the neighborhood, how she kept things in order, as though her reign of terror had been some necessary evil. Barbecues turned into debates, church meetings into battlegrounds. It wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about truth versus fear, justice versus control. For me, there was no question. I had seen Karen for who she really was, long before the gunfire echoed across my sister's wedding. Her cruelty wasn't an accident, it wasn't stress, and it wasn't misunderstanding. It was deliberate, carefully constructed, and sustained for years. The shooting wasn't the first time she had destroyed lives. It was just the first time the world saw it without her mask. And I was determined that it would be the last. The detectives asked me for my account, and I gave it to them in sharp detail. But I didn't stop there. I began gathering everything I could: emails she had sent threatening fines, letters slipped under doors, testimony from neighbors too scared to speak, until now. One by one, stories emerged. A widow fined thousands for keeping her late husband's truck parked in the driveway. A family threatened with eviction over their children playing too loudly in the yard. Elderly neighbors bullied into selling their homes at a loss just to escape her harassment. The list was endless, each account another stone in the wall of evidence against her. Yet, as I uncovered more, resistance grew stronger. HOA board members called me vindictive. They accused me of harassment, twisting reality until it bent to their narrative. They posted flyers urging neighbors to stand with Karen, painting her as a victim of a vendetta. It would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. The same lies that had once silenced the community now tried to silence me. But Karen's mistake was underestimating me. She thought I was just another neighbor, another victim to intimidate into submission. She didn't know that my connection to her went deeper, that the wounds she had left in my life had festered into something stronger than fear. Her reign had ended the second she fired that first bullet, but her downfall would come when the truth, every sordid, painful detail, was laid bare for the world to see. The neighborhood's divide reached a breaking point at the next HOA meeting. With Karen absent, her allies tried to seize control, gavel in hand, insisting that business must go on. But I stood and spoke, not with rage, but with clarity. I told the room about the wedding, about the fear etched on children's faces, about the bullet holes in sacred walls. I told them about the years of harassment, the intimidation, the cruelty masked as order. And slowly, I watched as heads began to nod, as whispers shifted, as courage returned to neighbors who had forgotten what it felt like to resist. Still, there were those who clung to her, too deep in her pocket to let go. "You don't understand," one board member muttered, his face pale. "Karen knows things about us. If she goes down, she'll drag us all with her." And in that moment, the truth became undeniable. This wasn't just about one woman. It was about a system she had built, a network of fear and corruption that infected the entire neighborhood. To bring her down meant pulling the thread until the whole rotten fabric unraveled. The investigation was no longer just a police matter. It was a battle for the soul of the community. Some neighbors would fight beside me, others against me, but the line had been drawn. Karen might have been the face of the nightmare, but the HOA was her fortress, and I was prepared to tear it down brick by brick. Because the gunshots at my sister's wedding were not the end. They were the beginning, the moment her lies began to collapse, the moment her empire started to crumble. And as the investigation pressed deeper, as the community chose sides, one truth echoed louder than all the rest. Karen had spent years believing she could destroy others without consequence. But now, for the first time, she was the one being destroyed by the truth. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and old paper, but on the day of Karen's trial, it also smelled of fear. Reporters crowded outside with cameras flashing, their voices buzzing with questions. Neighbors, once cowed into silence, now lined the benches, their whispers sharp with curiosity and dread. The case had become more than a criminal trial. It was a reckoning. For years, Karen had played judge and jury over everyone's lives. Now, she stood in the defendant's chair, dressed in a stiff suit that couldn't hide the fire in her eyes, waiting to face judgment herself. She walked into the courtroom like she owned it, chin high, shoulders back, a smirk tugging at her lips, as if this were nothing more than another HOA meeting she could dominate. Even in shackles, she radiated arrogance. Her lawyers flanked her, armed with folders and prepared speeches. They had already begun spinning the narrative in the media. Karen wasn't a criminal, she was a misunderstood leader, a pillar of her community pushed to desperation by provocation. But no amount of spin could erase the sound of gunfire from that wedding day. The prosecution laid out the charges with precision: attempted murder, reckless endangerment, unlawful possession of a firearm on religious property. Each word landed like a hammer, the weight of her actions spelled out for all to hear. Witnesses were called, one after another, voices trembling as they described the terror of that afternoon. The pastor spoke of ducking behind the altar, clutching his Bible as bullets shattered stone. Guests recounted the screams, the chaos, the sheer disbelief that one woman could turn joy into horror. My sister's testimony was the hardest to hear. Her voice breaking as she described the gun tearing through her veil, the terror in her groom's eyes, the fear that she might never see tomorrow. But Karen sat through it all without flinching. She scribbled notes, whispered to her attorneys, rolled her eyes when testimonies grew too emotional. When it was her turn to speak, she rose with the confidence of someone who still believed she could bend reality to her will. "They've twisted everything," she declared, her voice sharp, echoing across the courtroom. "I didn't attack anyone. I defended this neighborhood. That wedding was illegal, a violation of our community's code. No one would listen, so I acted. I acted to protect the order I have spent years preserving. You should be thanking me, not condemning me." Gasps rippled through the room. The judge's gavel slammed for silence, but Karen's words had already revealed her strategy. She wasn't pleading for mercy, she was doubling down, painting herself as a martyr. Her lawyers leaned into the performance, producing letters from HOA allies who claimed Karen had always acted in the community's best interest. They showed records of fines and warnings, as if they proved she was a diligent leader rather than a tyrant. They even tried to argue that the gunshots were warning shots meant only to scare people into compliance. It might have worked, if not for the truth. When it was my turn to take the stand, the courtroom shifted. I could feel Karen's gaze drilling into me, her lips pressed tight, her eyes narrowing with recognition. She had dreaded this moment more than the sirens, more than the handcuffs, more than the trial itself. I spoke calmly, but my words carried weight sharper than any bullet. I recounted the wedding, yes, but I also peeled back the layers Karen had spent years hiding. I told the court about the letters, the intimidation, the endless harassment of families. I presented documents, recordings, testimonies from neighbors who had been too afraid to speak until now. Piece by piece, I dismantled the mask she had worn for so long. And then, when the tension in the room was stretched to its breaking point, I revealed the truth Karen had hoped no one would ever hear. This wasn't random, I said, my voice steady. Karen didn't just target my sister's wedding out of spite. She targeted my family because she's been trying to destroy us for years. And she thought she had succeeded until the day she saw me standing there. What she didn't know was that I'm not just another neighbor. I'm the child of the family she drove out years ago. The family she ruined with her lies. The family she thought would never come back. Gasps filled the courtroom. Karen's face drained of color, her mask finally cracking as whispers spread like wildfire through the benches. She opened her mouth to shout, to deny, but the words stuck in her throat. For the first time, she looked afraid. I continued. I told them how my parents had been humiliated, fined into debt, shamed into leaving the neighborhood because of Karen's relentless cruelty. How she had destroyed reputations, driven wedges between families, and wielded the HOA like a weapon. And how, all along, she believed no one would ever hold her accountable. But now, the tables had turned. The jury listened, their faces grim. The prosecution seized the moment, presenting the mountain of evidence we had collected. Neighbors testified one after another, voices rising with years of suppressed anger. The courtroom became a chorus of truth, each story another nail in the coffin of Karen's empire. Karen tried to fight back, interrupting, shouting over witnesses demanding to speak. But the judge silenced her, the gavel striking harder with each outburst. Her arrogance, once her greatest weapon, now betrayed her. The jury saw not a leader, but a woman unraveling before their eyes. The closing argument sealed it. The prosecution painted her as a tyrant who had finally crossed into violence. The defense tried to cling to the narrative of misunderstood protector, but it rang hollow in the wake of so much pain. When the verdict came, the room held its breath. The foreman rose, voice steady, guilty on all counts. The sound was thunderous, final, undeniable. My sister wept into her husband's arms. Neighbors embraced. And Karen? She collapsed back into her chair, her face twisted in disbelief, her reign of terror shattered at last. But as they led her away, her eyes found mine one last time. Hatred burned there still, mixed now with fear and the dawning realization that she had lost everything. And I knew, in that moment, that justice wasn't just a word. It was real. It was happening. When the verdict was read and Karen was led away in chains, it felt as if a storm that had raged for years was finally breaking. The courthouse emptied slowly, neighbors spilling onto the steps in hushed groups, their faces lit not just by relief, but by something that had been missing for too long, hope. For the first time in years, the neighborhood no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to the people again. My sister and her husband held hands as they stepped outside, sunlight glinting off her wedding band. Their wedding day had been scarred by terror, but it had not been erased. If anything, their love now carried an even deeper meaning. They had endured fire together and come out stronger. And though her gown was torn and her veil forever ruined, she smiled through her tears. That smile, fragile but unbroken, was proof that Karen's hatred had failed. Neighbors who had once cowered under Karen's gaze now embraced us openly. Some apologized for their silence, admitting that they had been too afraid to speak out before. Others thanked me for standing up when no one else dared. Stories spilled forth, accounts of fines, threats, sleepless nights spent under the weight of Karen's intimidation. The more people spoke, the clearer it became. Karen hadn't just tried to destroy my family. She had poisoned the lives of everyone around her. But now her poison was gone. The HOA scrambled in the aftermath, its leaders fractured without their queen. Some resigned, others begged forgiveness, and a few tried to cling to the old lies. But the community had changed. No one wanted Karens, rules, anymore. They wanted freedom, fairness, and peace. And slowly, step by step, the neighborhood began to heal. Kids played on sidewalks without fear of being scolded. Families decorated their homes without looking over their shoulders. For the first time in years, laughter replaced the whispers of dread. As for me, I finally laid to rest a burden I had carried since childhood. Karen had thought she erased my family when she forced us out, but she was wrong. We came back. We stood our ground. And in the end, she was the one erased from the board, from the neighborhood, from the false pedestal she had built for herself. Justice had caught up with her, and it had been delivered not with silence, but with truth. I'll never forget the sight of her face as the verdict was read. Not because of her anger, I had seen that 1,000 times, but because of the fear. For once, Karen was powerless. For once, she had no rules to twist, no neighbors to bully, no threats to wield. For once, she had to face the consequences of her own actions. And in that moment, I realized something important. Power built on fear can never last. It always crumbles when the truth finally stands up to it. My sister and her husband renewed their vows a month later in a quiet ceremony. No chaos, no interruptions, no shadows hanging overhead. Just love, family, and peace. And though it wasn't the wedding they had originally dreamed of, it was the one that mattered most, because it marked not just their beginning, but the end of Karen's reign. If there's one lesson I carry from it all, it's this: you can't let fear silence you. You can't let bullies, tyrants, or anyone who thrives on control steal your voice. Karen thought she had all the power, but she was wrong. The moment we stood together, the moment we told the truth, her power disappeared. And that's something I hope no one ever forgets. Because at the end of the day, love outlasts hate, family outlasts fear, and truth always outlasts lies. So, if you've ever stood up to someone who thought they could control you, if you've ever refused to let fear win, if you believe justice will always find its way, then this story was for you. And before you go, let me ask you one thing. Don't let this be the last story you hear. Hit that subscribe button, join this community, and stand with me as we share more tales of truth, justice, and resilience. Because the fight against fear isn't over, and together, we'll make sure the next Karen learns the same lesson. Sooner or later, they all fall.